I'm going to talk today about the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. It was written in 1942. C.S. Lewis was a professor of English literature, both at Oxford and Cambridge universities in England. He was one of the great writers of the 20th century and a great scholar. He is famous for the Chronicles of Narnia, and he's written science fiction books. Perelandra, Out of the Silent Planet, That Hideous Strength. He wrote a book called Mere Christianity, a classic book of apologetics. He wrote a book called Miracles, The Abolition of Man. Anyway, he's a beautiful writer. Anyway, this is an epistolary novel, and published in 1942, as I mentioned, during World War II. In the preface, he has a fictional account of where he got these letters. He says, "I have no intention of explaining how the correspondence which I now offer to the public fell into my hands." So he's got these letters. There's 31 of them. And he's not going to explain, he says, where he got them, how they fell into his hand. Now, we know where he got them, right? He wrote them. But in the preface, which is itself part of the fictional book itself, he says, "I have no intention of explaining how the correspondence which I now offer to the public fell into my hands." And then about the devils, or these demonic figures, he says there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight. So, see, I don't know exactly what C.S. Lewis believes about these devils, these demons, but I do believe he does think there is a spiritual world, and that these demonic forces are active in the world. And that's about all. He doesn't get into the details because he doesn't know. But based on Scripture, there seems to be a spiritual world that we're not aware of with our eyes. So anyway, he says, he believes in them. He says, don't take an excessive delight in them. I mean, the Christian life is not about being focused on demons and devils. So, whatever you believe about devils or demons is really not important. You could still enjoy the book, okay? It's more of a fictional device. But I think C.S. Lewis actually believes there are these spiritual forces. The letter is 30. There's a collection of 31 letters, and each letter has a different topic, right? So different themes of the book. Some of them have to deal with marriage. Some of them have to do with sex. Some of them have to do with just petty annoyances, how to, with fear and hope, anxiety, different things that people struggle with. And basically, Wormwood is offering advice to his nephew, Wormwood, on how to best get this person, he's called the patient, to get this patient to move away from Christianity, to move away from God. In the second letter, the patient has become a Christian. The letter begins this way. This is letter 2. "My dear Wormwood, I note with great displeasure that your patient has become a Christian." Now, there's going to be a penalty for that, of course. Do not indulge the hope that you will escape the usual penalties. Indeed, in your better moments, I trust you would hardly even wish to do so. In the meantime, we must make the best of the situation. There is no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn in the enemy's camp and are now with us. So basically, that's the desire of Screwtape in these letters, is to give his nephew Wormwood advice on how to reclaim the patient who has become a Christian, to reclaim the patient for our Father below. That's how he refers to the devil. So he wants to get the patient who has become a Christian back into the devil's camp. And all the letters are geared to offering advice to do so. Okay, let me look at letter 1. My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. So from the very beginning of the epistle, these letters, Screwtape begins by telling Wormwood, his nephew, he says, you're making a big mistake. You're trying to get this person who's on the verge of becoming a Christian, you're trying to win him to the devil's side by reason, by argument, by guiding his reading so he reads materialist books that deny the spiritual world. He says, that's not the way to go. I know what you say about guiding your patient's reading, taking care that he sees the good deals of materialist friend. Don't think you're going to win this person away from Christianity by having him become friends with a materialist and then having the materialist give him books to read to convince him that materialism is true. He says, that's very naive. It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so had he lived centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as a result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the daily press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn, contemporary, conventional, or ruthless. Now this is a key point. He says, jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. C.S. Lewis believes that Christianity is reasonable. He says, Screwtape is saying to his nephew Wormwood, if you want to keep the patient out from becoming a Christian, do not try to argue him out of it, because the enemy can reason too. Meaning, Christianity for Lewis is rational, it's reason. If you use your reason, it'll lead you to Christianity, not away from it. He says, rely on jargon. Appeal to the emotions, the passions, not to reason. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste your time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think that it is strong or stark or courageous. That is the philosophy of the future. That is the sort of thing he cares about. Don't rely on argument. That's basically, how propaganda works and how advertising works. And that's, you don't appeal to reason. Most people really don't think very critically. They're really swayed by their passions and emotions. And that's what the devil knows. Screwtape, he knows that. He says, the trouble with argument is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. He can argue too. Whereas in really practical propaganda of the kind I am concerned with, I am suggesting, he has been shown for centuries to be greatly inferior to our Father below. Our Father below is the devil. And then this is great for critical thinking. By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason, and once it is awake, who can foresee the result? Even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end up in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experiences. Your business is to fix his attention on the stream. Teach him to call it real life, and don't ask him what he means by real. So the Screwtape's strategy, which he's trying to convey to Wormwood, is to appeal to jargon, avoid rational argument, avoid trying to convince him through argumentation, because for Lewis, Christianity is rational. This and belief in God is rational. It's not irrational. So reason is going to lead to God, not away from God. So the devil is saying, appeal to propaganda. And actually, no matter what subject you're talking about, whether it's a death penalty, abortion, anything really, one way to win an argument is to avoid giving reasons, is to appeal to jargon. There in critical thinking there are called these informal fallacies, the confirmation bias, ad hominem, either or fallacies, red herrings, and so on. These are all ways to avoid reason, argumentation. And the reason they're very famous fallacies is because they work. And that's what the Screwtape knows. He says, don't appeal to, don't try to convince them through argumentation. Appeal to the emotions, appeal to jargon. And he gives an example. He said once he had this patient who was just about ready, he was in the library and he was reading, he started thinking about God. And the enemy, said, the devil had to do something. The enemy, of course, was at his elbow, and God, the enemy is God, and was at the person's elbow, trying to convince him, keep thinking about God. But and so what happened, before I knew where I was, this is Screwtape talking, I saw 20 years of my work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I was not such a fool. I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under control. That means his appetites under my control, and suggested that it was about time he had some lunch. The enemy, that's God, presumably made the counter-suggestion. You know how one can never quite overhear what he has to say to them, that this is more important than lunch. It's more important to think about God when you're thinking about it. Forget lunch. At least I think that's what it must have been for him. For when I said quite, in fact, much too important to tackle at the end of the morning, the patient brightened up considerably. And by the time I added much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind, he was already halfway to the door. Once he was in the street, the battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper and a number 73 bus going past. And before he reached the bottom of the steps, I had got him into an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with the books, a healthy dose of real life, by which he meant the bus and the newsboy, was enough to show him that all that sort of thing couldn't be true. He knew he had had a narrow escape in later years, was fond of talking about that, quote, that inarticulate sense for actuality, which is our ultimate safeguard against the aberrations of mere logic. He is now safe in our Father's house. So, that's letter 1. I will stop at this point. And I'll talk about some of the other letters in Screwtape Letters, but I'll stop at this point. Okay.